The wind shrieked across the prairie like a beast unchained, snapping at her skirts and tugging strands of auburn hair free from beneath her bonnet. Mary Ellen pressed her hand to her hat and squinted through the dust that danced in chaotic spirals, painting the sky in shades of ash. Behind her, the train whistle screamed one last time, then faded into the west, taking with it every thread of hope she had stitched into the journey. She stood on the platform of the frontier town of Whetstone Ridge, if it could be called a town. A few sagging buildings flanked the main road. A blacksmith's, a saloon and a general store with half the letters missing from its sign. Beyond that, nothing but endless dirt and sky. Her travel trunk, scuffed and sun-bleached, sat at her feet like an unwanted pet. She reached for the letter folded in her pocket, the one from Henry Clark of Whetstone Ridge, who had promised marriage, companionship, and a home. Mary Ellen watched the man approach. He was taller than she'd imagined, thick around the shoulders, with a coarse beard and eyes as flat as the land they stood on. Henry Clark, her intended. She smoothed the creases of her dress and stepped forward with a hopeful smile. "Mr. Clark," she said, extending her hand. He looked her over once, eyes traveling from her face to her full hips, down to the stitching of her boots. His lip curled. He didn't take her hand. "You didn't say nothing about being like this," he said, voice loud enough for the few bystanders to hear. Mary Ellen's smile faltered. "Like what, sir?" "Fat." The word hit her with the force of a thrown rock. Around them, the dusty silence deepened. A woman standing by the general store let out a small laugh, covering her mouth with her hand. Mary Ellen felt the blood rush to her cheeks. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain that her photograph had been taken years ago, before the loss of her first husband, before the long winter that had stolen both food and willpower. But Henry was already turning away. "I ain't got use for no lazy sow," he said over his shoulder. "Go back to wherever you came from." The words hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Then he was gone, disappearing behind the saloon doors. As if she were a hallucination brought on by heat and whiskey, Mary Ellen stood motionless. The train was gone. The man she had crossed 2 states to meet had dismissed her without a second thought. She glanced around, expecting someone to step forward, to offer a word of comfort, a hand of help. But no one moved. Even the wind seemed to retreat, leaving only the dry creak of a distant weather vane and the low murmur of cattle in a nearby pen. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her trunk. It was heavier than she remembered. Each step away from the station took more strength than the last, not because of the weight of her belongings, but because of the invisible burden now crushing her chest. Rejected, publicly, cruelly, and not for anything she'd said or done, just for being who she was. She found a shaded spot behind the general store and sat on the ground, pulling her trunk close like a shield. The tears came slowly, reluctant at first, then faster as the realization settled in. There was no plan B. She had sold everything she owned to make this trip. Her husband's old watch, her mother's silver comb, the tiny house back in Akron, with the leaky roof and lavender bush out front. She reached into her satchel and pulled out her journal. The leather cover was worn, the edges curled from years of handling. She turned to a blank page and, with a shaking hand, began to write. April 17th, 1873. Whetstone Ridge, rejected at the platform. No lodging, no money, no husband. I was foolish to believe someone could want me again. Not like this. Not with this body that remembers every insult ever thrown at it. I am tired of being an apology. The sun dipped lower, staining the sky with orange and red. She forced herself up and dragged her trunk down the main road. She tried the saloon first, asked if they rented rooms upstairs. The barkeep didn't even look up. "Not to your kind," he muttered. She tried the inn next. A woman with steel-grey hair peered through the cracked door, taking her in like she was a mongrel on the porch. "We don't rent to unescorted ladies," she said, voice tight, "especially not ones with your circumstances." Mary Ellen bit back the reply forming in her throat. She thanked the woman, turned away. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She walked until the town was behind her, the buildings shrinking like dying embers in the dusk. Fields stretched out, in every direction, broken only by fence posts and the occasional lone tree. Her legs burned, her feet ached, and still she kept walking. She found a dilapidated hunting shack near the edge of a dry creek bed. The door hung crooked on its hinges, but the roof seemed intact, and the walls, though splintered, would keep out the wind. She pushed the door open with her shoulder, coughed at the smell of old rot, then stepped inside. It was no home, but it would do. She built a small fire in the rusted stove using kindling she gathered along the creek. Her fingers were numb and blistered, her dress torn at the hem, her boots caked with dried mud. She sat by the fire and ate the last of her hard bread. Each bite felt like chewing through regret. Night fell in pieces, slow at first, then all at once. Coyotes howled in the distance. She lay on the floor with her trunk pulled close and the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Sleep came like a thief, silent, cruel, and unwelcome. Morning brought the smell of dew and the sound of birdsong, but no peace. She stretched, wincing at the soreness in her back. Her journal lay beside her, half open, words from the night before smudged by tears. She spent the day gathering wood, scavenging for berries along the creek. Her dress grew filthier, but she didn't care. Her hands found rhythm in the work, her mind quieted by necessity. She boiled water, made weak tea with old leaves, and sat by the fire as the sky turned peach and lavender. Days blurred into each other. She walked to town only when she had to, trading thread and needles from her trunk for dried beans or lye soap. The stares never stopped. Neither did the whispers. But she learned to stop caring. Each day that she survived without begging, without breaking, was a small rebellion. One evening she stared into the fire for a long time, watching embers rise like fireflies. She took out her journal and wrote, "No man came, but I am still here." That must mean something. I wake, I eat, I breathe, I refuse to shrink. She thought of her husband then, Elias, gone 5 years now. He had been a kind man, if not a wealthy one. A store clerk with clumsy hands and a warm laugh. He had called her my sun-warmed girl and traced the lines of her arms as if they were maps to buried treasure. When he died in the war, everything good in her seemed to die too. People said she should remarry. Others whispered behind fans that she'd never manage it, not with her looks, not with her weight, as if grief should make her small. In the flickering shadows of the shack, Mary Ellen remembered his voice. "You are not too much. They are simply too little to hold you." She slept better that night. A week passed. Then another. She began to understand the rhythms of the land, the calls of birds at dusk, the rustle of foxes in the underbrush. Her body, once sluggish, grew stronger with every day. She could lift the trunk easily now, chop wood without blistering. Her hands, once soft and pale, were calloused and brown. Still, the loneliness was a ghost that clung to her. In the quiet hours, she whispered aloud just to hear a voice. She sang old hymns, not for faith, but for memory. Her reflection in the creek was still round-faced, soft-bodied, but her eyes held something different now. Steel, maybe, or stubbornness. One afternoon, a dust storm swept in without warning. The sky darkened, the wind howled, and she barely made it back to the shack before the worst of it hit. Huddled by the fire, heart pounding, she thought of the people in town, safe behind locked doors. She was nobody to them, less than that. But to the storm, she was alive, fighting. And then, through the howling wind, She heard it, hoofbeats, fast, heavy, coming closer. She reached for the rifle Elias had left her, her only inheritance besides memory, and stood by the door, bracing herself. The knock when it came was sharp, not threatening, but not gentle either. Mary Ellen cracked open the door, eyes squinting through the dust. He stood tall, wrapped in a fur-lined coat, face half covered by a scarf, hair wild and wet with grit. A rifle slung across his back. A stranger, his eyes locked onto hers, grey, unreadable, like a winter sky. And just for a moment something passed between them, recognition, pity, or something older, harder to name. He didn't speak, just nodded once and held out a bundle wrapped in canvas. She took it. Meat, dried venison, enough to last her days. When she looked up, he was already turning away. Mary Ellen stared after him, the wind tugging at her skirts, the bundle warm in her hands. The silence he left behind felt different than the one before. For the first time in weeks, it wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. The storm broke just after dusk. It wasn't the kind that gave warning, no grey build-up or subtle shift in the wind. One moment the sky was clear, the next it split apart like something ancient and angry had finally decided to scream. Thunder cracked across the plains with a voice deeper than any man's, and rain followed like 1,000 needles falling from the heavens. Mary Ellen had just finished boiling water when the first gust slammed against the shack, making the wooden walls groan like a dying animal. She rushed to the door and forced it closed against the gale, latching it with trembling hands. Her fire hissed in protest, smoke curling toward the ceiling, and outside the wind howled like wolves had found their way into the sky. She gathered her shawl around her shoulders and checked the floor where her supplies lay. The roof was holding for now. The patch she'd hammered over the hole with a piece of flattened tin was rattling, but it hadn't torn loose. Not yet. Then she heard it. Not thunder, not wind, something heavier, closer. Hoofbeats. They came fast, slicing through the storm, accompanied by the frantic snort of a terrified animal. She stood frozen, heart lurching into her throat. The storm should have kept any sane man inside. Whoever was riding in this wasn't running from rain. They were running from something worse, a scream of hooves. Then a thud. She threw the door open. Just beyond the reach of the flickering firelight, a mule was staggering sideways, reins tangled around its legs, nostrils flared. Its rider was already on the ground, sprawled in the mud like a sack of grain. Mary Ellen didn't think. She grabbed her lantern, lit it from the stove's flame, and ran out into the storm. Rain battered her face, soaked through her dress within seconds. She dropped to her knees beside the man. He was big, broad across the chest, arms corded with lean muscle even under a soaked leather coat. His hat had fallen, revealing dark hair, slicked to his scalp, and a gash across his temple oozed blood into the mud. She pressed her fingers to his neck. His pulse thudded, slow but steady. Alive. She looked around, half expecting someone to come running to call out. But of course no. One did. Out here there was only her. With a grunt she hooked her arms under his and began to drag. Her boots slipped. Mud sucked at her heels. The wind threw fists at her back, but inch by inch she pulled him across the yard and into the shelter of the shack. The mule miraculously followed, drawn by instinct or the meager warmth inside. She shut the door with her shoulder and dropped beside him, gasping for breath. Her hands were shaking. The fire was nearly out. She shoved more kindling into the stove and fanned it until the orange glow returned, then turned her attention to the stranger. His coat was soaked through. She peeled it off, revealing a blood-stained shirt and a belt that held a hunting knife, a pistol, and 2 empty holsters. He looked like a man who'd seen more battles than years. Scars crisscrossed his hands and forearms, one particularly deep, one jagged across his collarbone like a lightning strike made of flesh. She fetched a clean cloth and pressed it to his head. He flinched, then his eyes opened. For a moment they stared at each other in silence. His were grey, not dull, not lifeless, but cold, like the sea on a winter morning. Her own breath hitched. There was no fear in his expression, no confusion, only the faint flicker of awareness. "You're safe," she said quietly, unsure if he understood. "You were thrown, or something." He blinked slowly, then tried to sit up. Pain flashed across his face, and he hissed through his teeth. "You'll rip it worse if you move," she warned, pressing gently on his shoulder. He didn't argue. He lay back, eyes still on her, watching, measuring. She shifted beside him and wrapped the cloth tighter around his head. His skin was warm, too warm. Fever coming. "What's your name?" she asked. He didn't answer. She tried again. "I'm Mary Ellen." Still silence. Just the rain hammering the roof and the occasional crackle from the stove. She stood and filled a tin cup with hot water, dropped in the last of her dried herbs, willow bark and yarrow, and handed it to him. He took it with steady hands, sipped, slowly. His jaw clenched as he swallowed, but he drank it all. Then he said quietly, "Jack." Just that. No last name. No explanation. She nodded, then settled onto her stool and watched him drift into sleep. He didn't snore. He barely breathed. But he didn't let go of the cup until the last moment, and even then, his fingers stayed curled like he was ready to fight for it. Jack stayed 3 nights. He never asked questions, never offered answers. In that time, Mary Ellen learned a few things by observation. His boots were army issue, but weathered far beyond regulation. His hands bore calluses not just from farming or riding, but from years of drawing bowstrings or wielding knives. His coat had a crow design stitched inside the lining, faded but clear. When she asked about it, he only said, "My mother's." The second night, she found him standing outside in the rainless dark, barefoot, eyes turned to the stars like he'd forgotten she existed. When she called his name, he looked at her as though he'd just remembered where he was. On the 4th morning, he rose before sunrise, packed his things, saddled the mule. She stood in the doorway, shawl tight around her shoulders, watching him. "You should rest longer," she said. He glanced at her, then handed her a wrapped bundle. Inside were strips of smoked meat, 2 flints and a sharpening stone. "I'll manage," he said, and then he was gone, fading into the mist like a character from a half-remembered dream. But he came back. 2 days later, she returned from gathering, kindling, and found a bundle at her door, wrapped in wax cloth. Inside, salt, beans, and a small tin of lard. No note, no sign of who had left it. The next week he appeared again, this time with a skinned rabbit which he handed over without comment. They sat near the fire that night, eating in silence. She didn't ask why he'd come. He didn't explain. This pattern continued. Weeks passed. The town became a distant memory, a place she visited only when absolutely necessary. Out here, beyond the eyes of people who measured worth in waistlines and coin, something else began to grow. Not comfort, not yet, but something like respect. Jack spoke little, but when he did, his words were never wasted. He taught her to snare rabbits, how to clean a wound with pine resin, when to walk softly through the brush to avoid drawing the attention of a bear. She taught him how to mend clothes, though he grumbled. The whole time. She caught him once, holding the hem of a shirt she'd stitched, fingers tracing the seams like he didn't quite believe it had been done by hand. One night, as the wind whistled low outside, she found him sitting by the fire, shirt off, tending a gash across his leg. It was old but angry-looking, red and swollen. "Let me," she said. He didn't move as she knelt beside him, didn't flinch when she pressed a hot cloth to the wound. But when she began stitching it shut, his jaw tightened. "You've done this before," he said. "My husband. The war took him in pieces. I stitched what I could." Jack didn't respond. But when she finished, he looked at her, really looked, and nodded once. It felt like something unspoken passed between them in that moment. Not affection, not yet, but understanding. A recognition of another soul who had suffered, who had learned. To keep moving anyway, he didn't leave that night. By now his mule knew the way to the shack without guidance. He'd begun bringing extra supplies, salt, flour, a bag of coffee. She asked him why once. He shrugged. "You feed me. Fair trade." But she knew it wasn't just that. Trust came slowly, not in speeches or gestures, but in shared silence. In the way Jack handed her his knife without hesitation, in the way he watched her back when they were out gathering wood, in the way he stepped between her and danger without needing to be asked. One afternoon, they heard riders in the distance. Jack's posture changed instantly. He pulled her behind the shack, signaled for silence, and waited. The riders passed without incident, but his tension didn't ease until long after they'd gone. Later, over supper, she asked, "What are you running from?" He looked into the fire. "Not running," he said, "just done chasing." She didn't push. She understood that kind of weariness. That night, she lay awake long after the fire had died, listening to the sound of Jack's even breathing. He slept near the door, one hand always close to his rifle. A protector who didn't ask to be one, a man who had learned, like her, that the world was not kind, but still chose to remain in it. When she drifted off, she dreamed of wolves and firelight, and a voice that said, "You are no longer alone." In the morning, Jack was still there, still silent, but something had shifted. Neither of them said it aloud. But the next time he left, he didn't take all his things with him. Spring crept into the frontier like a trespasser testing locked doors, softening the ground and coaxing stubborn green from beneath the frost-bitten soil. The snow melted in streaks, revealing earth that smelled of ash and cold memory. Mary Ellen stood barefoot at the creek's edge. Sleeves rolled past her elbows, washing linen in the biting current. Her hands were red, her wrists sore, but the task no longer weighed on her like punishment. It was just work, necessary, repetitive, almost comforting. Behind her, the sound of an axe echoed in slow, deliberate rhythm. Jack, splitting logs near the shack. He'd been back for more than a month this time. No explanations, no promises, just presence. The silence between them had grown familiar, less like a wall and more like a blanket wrapped around shared purpose. There were still things she didn't know, what he'd done before, who he had run from. But she had stopped, needing those answers. Trust, after all, didn't always arrive with a name. She wrung out the cloth and turned to find him watching her, axe resting against his shoulder, breath misting in the chill air. His gaze wasn't leering or soft. It just was. Like wind or rain or the smell of pine. A constant. She nodded once. He returned the gesture and went back to work. That afternoon, she baked bread from the last of their flour. The smell filled the shack, warm and sweet, and Jack sat nearby sharpening his knife with slow, even strokes. He didn't speak, but when she offered him the first slice, he took it without hesitation and chewed with the slow reverence of a man who'd known true hunger. Outside, the sky turned silver as clouds gathered on the horizon. A storm was coming, but not the kind that sent men to their knees. This one whispered instead of screamed, rain without thunder, wind without violence. Jack stood and stretched, his muscles rippling under the thin cotton of his shirt. "We need to trap before the weather turns?" Mary Ellen nodded. They packed supplies into a sack and headed east into the wooded edges of the prairie where foxes and rabbits left their trails. The ground was slick, their boots sinking into moss and mud. They worked in tandem, Jack setting snares, Mary Ellen marking trees with strips of cloth for easy return. Her eyes scanned the ground, searching for fresh prints, while his ears caught every sound between branches. They paused near a thicket when Jack raised his hand, signaling silence. She froze. Voices. Not close, but not far either. Drifting through. The trees like smoke. Male, rough, at least 3. They weren't singing or laughing, just talking in that flat, suspicious tone men use when they don't trust each other and trust strangers even less. Mary Ellen looked to Jack. His face had gone still. "Bandits?" she whispered. "Could be," he replied low. "Could be worse." They backed away slowly, boots silent in the undergrowth. Jack made no sound, not even a snapped twig. Mary Ellen followed, heart thudding, breath tight in her throat. They didn't speak again until they were back at the shack, door bolted, rifles within arm's reach. "They weren't from town," he said as he cleaned the barrel of his weapon. "No badges, no clear markings." "They'll pass through?" she asked, trying to believe it. Jack didn't answer. He only looked at her, his silence speaking more than any words could. That night she couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, rustling branches against the walls like restless fingers. Every creak became footsteps, every gust a voice. She sat, up in bed, clutching her shawl, staring into the fire's dying glow. Jack stirred across the room, then rose and crossed to her side. "They won't catch us off guard," he said simply. "Have you dealt with men like that before?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "Yes." She didn't ask what he'd done. She didn't need to. His face told her the story. Grief buried under caution. A man who'd once fought not because he wanted to, but because survival left no other option. He returned to his bed, but neither of them truly slept. By morning, the world was grey and wet, the air thick with anticipation. They didn't speak of what they'd heard. Instead, they moved with quiet urgency. Jack repaired the locks on the shack's door. Mary Ellen reinforced the window shutters with spare boards. They checked the snares early, retrieved 2 rabbits, and returned before noon. She skinned them by the creek, the blade moving swiftly under her fingers. Jack stood watch nearby, rifle slung over one shoulder, gaze never resting. The tension between them hummed, not fear exactly, but readiness. That evening, as the rain finally began to fall, Mary Ellen stood at the window and watched the trail that led back to town. Nothing moved, no riders, no sound but the hiss of water meeting soil. She turned and found Jack watching her again. "Would you leave?" she asked, "if it became dangerous?" His eyes didn't waver. No. She didn't know what answer she had hoped for. Relief warred with fear. "Why not?" He paused, then answered simply, "Because I gave you my back, and you gave me yours." A strange warmth bloomed in her chest, unexpected, fierce. She nodded and returned to the fire, where the bread rose and the stew thickened with roots and rabbit meat. He joined her a few minutes later. They ate in silence, save for the patter of rain on the roof. At midnight the sound came again, hoofbeats, closer this time. Jack was up before she could move, rifle in hand. He peered through the slats in the shutter. Mary Ellen reached for Elias's old revolver, checking the chamber like Jack had taught her. 3 riders, lanterns swinging, laughing now, loud, careless. "They're drunk," Jack muttered. "That doesn't make them less dangerous." The riders stopped just beyond the tree line. One dismounted, kicked over a trap they had placed days ago, and shouted something crude into the night. Another drew his pistol and fired into the air. Jack stepped toward the door. "No!" Mary Ellen whispered, grabbing his arm. "It's not worth it. They'll come back," he said, voice tight. "Next time they'll be closer. But not tonight," she said. "Not now." He looked at her, eyes hard as flint. Then, with visible effort, he lowered the rifle. They watched the men ride away. The next morning, they found the traps smashed, the markers gone, their path back to the creek muddied with hoofprints. A warning. Mary Ellen picked up a piece of torn cloth left dangling from a branch, her own marker. Shredded and dirtied, her fingers curled around it. "They want us gone," she said. Jack looked out at the horizon. "Then we stay." That night, he sat closer to her by the fire. They shared the same blanket for the first time, not from necessity, but from quiet. Agreement, his shoulder brushed hers, her hand rested near his, neither spoke of it. But when her fingers touched his, he didn't pull away. The days that followed were uneasy. The riders didn't return, but their presence lingered like smoke. Jack began scouting farther out, returning with intelligence as precise as a soldier's. How? Many horses. Which direction they'd come from, whether their fires burned at night or not. Mary Ellen took over the hunting. Her hands no longer trembled when holding a rifle. Her eyes, once quick to lower, now met stares head-on. They were preparing for something they couldn't name, but felt coming all the same. One evening, Jack returned with a cut across his cheek and blood drying on his shirt. She rushed to him, panic tight in her throat. "It's not mine," he said. "That should have calmed her. It didn't." "Whose then?" she asked. He sat down, removed his coat. "One of theirs. They followed me. I let them." She stared. "You baited them?" "They needed to know I wasn't afraid." Mary Ellen knelt in front of him and began cleaning the wound, each touch gentle but firm. "You'll provoke them." "They were already provoked. I just reminded them I'm not easy prey." Her hands stilled. "And me?" "What about me, Jack?" He looked at her then, and something shifted in the space between them. "You're the reason I stay," he said. "It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was truth. And in a world that had offered Mary Ellen nothing but cruelty and rejection, truth, spoken, plainly offered without price, was more valuable than gold. She leaned in and kissed him, not a fevered rush, but a slow, sure press of lips to lips, a promise, a question, a homecoming. Jack didn't flinch. He kissed her back, steady and real. When they pulled apart, the fire had burned low, but the warmth remained. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the walls like it was trying to get in. Inside, they were quiet, but not afraid. The first shot cracked the stillness just after dawn. It didn't sound like warning. It sounded like intent. Mary Ellen dropped the tin cup she'd been drying and reached for the rifle by the hearth. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Jack was already out the door, quiet as breath, his revolver low and ready. The frost hadn't yet burned off the grass, and smoke from their breakfast fire curled into the pale sky as though trying to disappear before things went wrong. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Then a man's voice, rough and sharp as broken glass. "We know you're in there." Jack crouched near the edge of the porch, eyes narrowing toward the trees. 3 figures, same riders from before. But now they weren't just watching. They were hunting. Mary Ellen joined him, her rifle raised but her breath steady. She hadn't asked to be part of this. But the woman she used to be, the one who cried quietly under blankets, who had once been told she was too soft, too big, too wrong to be wanted, had died in the cold weeks of that first winter. What stood here now was made of gristle and ash, rebuilt with rough hands and no apologies. "They've got rifles. All 3, Jack murmured, his voice flat. "One circling east. He wants to flank us." "Let him," she said, eyes flicking. "To the side trail near the creek. That's where I strung a wire. He won't make it far." He looked at her not with surprise, but with quiet pride. "We hold them here, fast, hard. We let them know we're not prey." She nodded. Together, the men moved in slow, wide arcs, thinking they had the advantage. Their confidence dripped off them like cheap cologne. Jack watched, waited, until the nearest stepped past the line of pines. One shot. The man crumpled like a sack of grain, his rifle clattering against stone. Then chaos. The others shouted, took cover, returned fire. Bullets punched into the side of the shack, sending splinters flying. Mary Ellen ducked behind the woodpile, breathing through her teeth. Her palms were sweating, but she held firm. The one on the eastern flank made it just 10 feet past the hidden wire before the snare caught him. His scream tore through the woods, followed by a sickening thud as he hit the earth. Jack didn't waste time. He crossed the yard like a shadow, fast and silent. A brief struggle, then silence. 2 down. The last man, realizing the balance had shifted, turned to flee. But Mary Ellen was already moving, cutting behind the shed, flanking him. from the rear. He never saw her coming. Her rifle was heavy, her voice steady. "Drop it!" He froze, spun halfway, and she saw it, the decision bloom in his eyes. Not surrender, stubborn pride. He raised his pistol. She didn't hesitate. The shot echoed, sending birds skyward. He fell. When the quiet settled again, it wasn't peaceful, it was final. Jack appeared moments later, his face unreadable, weapon still drawn. Mary Ellen didn't speak. She stood over the man's body, breath shallow, hand trembling slightly. Jack reached out, not to take the rifle from her, but to steady her wrist. That was all. No words, just a reminder she wasn't alone. They buried the men far from the creek, no markers, no names. "Do you think this is over?" she asked that evening, scrubbing blood from her palms with cold water until her skin burned. Jack sat nearby, sharpening his knife by firelight. "No, but it's quiet for now. That's all we ever get. Then we make the most of it." He looked at her for a long time, as if seeing her for the first time all over again. "I knew you were strong," he said. "Didn't know you were steel." She smiled, the corners of her mouth pulling slow. "You're not the first to underestimate me." That night, they didn't sleep in separate corners. They lay together on the bed, built from pine and rough. Nails, her head on his shoulder, his arm wrapped tight around her like a vow. Outside, the wind whispered of things to come, but inside, there was warmth. The next week passed in a rhythm of recovery. The shack bore scars, bullet holes in the walls, broken boards, blackened marks where fire had tried to catch. Jack repaired what he could. Mary Ellen did the rest. The town didn't come asking questions. They never did. People out here had long learned to let silence do the talking. Whatever trouble had come their way, it hadn't returned. Word must have traveled, but something else had taken root in the air between Mary Ellen and Jack. It wasn't just survival anymore. One morning she caught him tracing a finger across the scar on his collarbone. "What happened?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away, just kept staring at the fire. "Apache raid. I was 12. They took my mother, burned the house. My father died trying to fight them off. I hid under the floorboards like a rat." She didn't interrupt. "Let him say it in his time." "Years later I found her again. She'd made a life with them, married one of their warriors, had children. She didn't come back." He looked at her then. "I hated her for that. But I think I understand now. She found a place to be seen, to be enough." Mary Ellen reached for his hand. "You've found that too," she whispered. They held each other like that for a long time, wrapped in a silence that meant something. But the frontier didn't care for healing. It just waited for the next crack. 3 weeks after the attack, Mary Ellen spotted riders again on the western ridge. 4 this time, moving slow, not scouts, not soldiers, but not drunk fools either. They were organized. Jack watched them through the spyglass. "They're looking, not charging. Maybe waiting for night." Mary Ellen set her jaw. "Then we don't wait." That afternoon they packed only what they needed. Jack saddled the mule. Mary Ellen wrapped her journals, her letters, and the little tin of seeds she'd been saving for a garden she never got to plant. They didn't speak as they left the shack, only looked back once. The wind stirred the grass like a farewell. They traveled north, away from known paths, deep into the woods Jack knew like the lines on his palm. He led without doubt. She followed without fear. For days they moved silently, camping beneath pine trees, eating in silence. But each night, when they lay beside one another, their hands always found each other. Eventually, they came upon a hollow, a natural shelter beneath a cliff, hidden from the sky. "Water nearby, game trails close. This will do," Jack said. Mary Ellen looked around, fingers brushing moss-covered stone. "It's beautiful." They built again, together. The cabin was smaller than the last, but tighter, stronger. Jack carved patterns into the beams, symbols she didn't recognize. He told her they were from his mother's people. "For protection," he said. One night, as firelight danced across the walls, she took his hand and placed it over her heart. "I was told no one would ever want me," she said quietly. "That I was too soft, too heavy, that I'd be lucky to be pitied." Jack didn't speak. He only leaned forward, kissed her like a man returning to something sacred. When he pulled back, his voice was barely more than breath. They were wrong. Months passed. The world changed. Jack hunted. Mary Ellen grew herbs. They laughed more often, argued sometimes, slept always in the same bed. One spring evening, she stood in the doorway of their new home, hand on her belly. Jack came up behind her, slid his arms around her waist. She didn't have to say it. He already knew. He rested his chin on her shoulder, eyes on the horizon. "They'll have your strength," he whispered. "They'll have your fire," she replied. And in the distance, the prairie exhaled, carrying away the ghosts, the pain, the noise of a world that had once rejected them both. They had carved out a place, not perfect, but theirs, and it was enough. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the quiet strength of those who survive when the world tries to break them, and the power of unexpected love to rebuild what's been lost. Like, comment, and subscribe to hear more tales of resilience, redemption, and wild frontier hearts. We'll be waiting just beyond the firelight.